monster.
We can finish this. Are you ready?
Yeah.
We are talking about the bizarre superhero-ish movie Archenemy. This one is directed and co-written by Adam Egypt Mortimer and stars Joe Manganiello. Now, this movie, I would suggest, is a mix between the Kevin Spacey movie K-Pax meets James Gunn's Super. I would say maybe you can sprinkle in a little bit of Punisher in there as well, and a kind of a whole lot of art house. So what we have, Joe Manganiello's character is called Max Fist, you know, super kind of hero name if there ever was one. And he is a homeless person who seems to be crazy and telling everyone that will listen that he has come from an alternate dimension where he was the superhero of this kind of universe. And he had to kind of defeat his arch enemy, but in doing so, he's ended up in our dimension, powerless and a bum on the street. Now we have this kind of young, upcoming reporter called Hamster, who, you know, comes from somewhat of a deprived background, and he's trying to kind of break into this kind of BuzzFeed style kind of online news outlet, and he kind of decides he's going to try and cover this guy, and ultimately becomes somewhat of a kind of a, you know, a sensation. And as kind of the story progresses, Hamster and Max end up becoming, you know, somewhat kind of bonded, and Hamster starts to question, you know, is this guy crazy, or is there actually some truth to maybe what he's saying? Because he seems to know things like string theory and a lot of information that you would maybe not think, you know, you kind of average bum might know. What'll happen? You have to watch the movie to find out. So let's talk about what works in the movie. I think the idea here and the kind of the synopsis, you might say, is strong. It's not entirely original, I will say, because we have seen, you know, superhero dramas that mix in kind of elements of mental illness before. I've already mentioned James Gunn's Super that starred Rainn Wilson, which kind of, a, you know, in a way covered a kind of a similar topic where we had this guy who imagined he was a kind of a superhero. But we've also had things like Defender and Kick-Ass to a certain degree with the kind of the Big Daddy character, and you've almost got real, you know, Marvel and DC characters that do, you know, you could argue have elements of crazy within their character, and I think the Punisher is probably one you can kind of, you know, count that, and the movie has elements of the Punisher in it. So I feel although the idea is strong, it's not entirely original, and what they do with the kind of the idea is a little questionable, which we'll come on to, but I think at least the premise is interesting. I did like the relationship here between Hamster and Max, because I felt it was quite strong, and I like the kind of some of their dialogue scenes. And there is a lot of dialogue in this movie. It is somewhat kind of a dialogue-driven movie rather than a kind of an action film, but I did enjoy some of the kind of sequences within that. There are a couple of interesting action sequences. Now, around the halfway through, you don't really know, obviously, if Max is really kind of this kind of superhero, or whether he is like obviously some type of crazy person. But he kind of suits up a little bit like the Punisher about halfway through the movie, and it makes you realise that Joe Manganiello may well have been a good Punisher, as the Punisher in the comics was originally kind of an Italian for heritage, and obviously Manganiello is as well, I believe. And it kind of goes into this kind of like hardcore action sequence. But then it kind of ends up going in other directions as well. I think the movie has a lot of ideas and is somewhat ambitious, but ultimately a little bit of a jumble because of this. The movie is kind of spliced in with these animated segments, which are meant to give you kind of a look at this imaginary or potentially real homeland of chromium that Max Steel's character claims that he comes from. And although it does break up the story somewhat, I have to say the animated sequences are somewhat kind of a little bit too artistic, maybe, for some. The real problem with this movie is I feel it is directionless. And I say that because, to be honest with you, I think it's relatively poorly directed. There's no real sense of where this movie wants to go. There's too many ideas. There's too many characters. We have a lot of peripheral characters from the kind of the mid-level kind of like drug lord, his goons, a kind of a female character that is kind of like introduced but hinted at through the whole movie, and it doesn't come into it until the end. Things like this. There's a little bit too much kind of going on. Too many kind of like things happening here. And the movie just seems to meander around, never really knowing where it wants to go. And it kind of dips its toe into so many different potential kind of plot lines, then kind of like changes its mind and does something else. As I say, about halfway through the movie, the second act, you know, we think it's going to go into an action movie sort of mode, if that makes sense. But then it kind of ends up being a lot more melodramatic. But I don't think unfortunately, the acting chops of some of our actors here can really pull those scenes off, and it just seems like cliche characters posturing and saying cheesy dialogue. Now, I don't know if some of this was intentional, you know, kind of the way comics are read, and, you know, somehow the characters are kind of speaking like that, but the way it translates to screen just seems very messy, to be honest. The movie, to be honest with you, is a little dull, and I think it's because the storyline simply isn't gripping. It's too meandering, like I said, directionless. The performances are a mixed bag. I did enjoy the hamster character, and to his sister a degree as well. But then we have a lot of time spent with these drug dealers. There seems to be pointless kind of almost diversions into kind of other things and stuff, and it ends up being a real missed opportunity. I've seen this compared to The Boys. No, not at all. It's kind of like one of these just straight to kind of video, straight to kind of like VOD style films that has a germ of a good idea, but the execution of it is quite poor, and unfortunately it just doesn't look like there's been a huge amount of care taken with it. I think Joe Manganiello is trying his best, and I think he works in the physical aspects, but I don't know if the dramatic elements here are really that strong. And to be honest with you, this movie leans quite heavily on the dramatic side, and unfortunately fails in that regard. I'll give it a 4 out of 10. I actually found this quite disappointing, to be honest. Does not live up to its potential. Some good ideas, poorly executed. 4 out of 10. Have you seen it? What did you think of it? Leave me a comment, and I'll look forward to seeing you next time. Bye for now.